Welcome back to another episode of 40 Facts About the 40K Universe. I am your host Gershwan and you are watching One Mind Syndicate. Today we continue talking about the orcs as we get into a specific mob, Krogskull's Boys, a mob of burner boys. If you're new to the channel, subscribe. We post Warhammer 40K content every single day, and if you have any suggestions, just comment down below. But with that said, let's get into 40 facts on Krogskull's Boys. The arrival of the orcs on Vigilus was chaotic. The greenskins' ramshackled ships descended across the planet to land in the vast wastelands between the continental hive sprawls, and from these scattered craft, the first assault waves were launched against the Imperial cities. There was little unity to the orcs' actions, and though their hordes were large and raring for a fight, they were halted by the physically charged force fields surrounding the hive sprawls. Before long, many of the orcs grew bored with the static battles that raged along the impenetrable city perimeter, and took to building enormous convoys of vehicles with which to race across the barren flats. While their force fields held, the denizens of Vigilus remained relatively safe. Travel between the hive sprawls was extremely hazardous. The orcs speeding across the wastelands shot down passing aircraft and swarmed the land-based transports. But only small mobs of orcs made it through the defensive lines and into the cities. This stalemate was not to last. The warp storms that had spat forth the orcs continued to grow across the galaxy, merging together into hideous scars that bathed Vigilus day and night in a sickly glow. Eventually, the coalescence of these storms led to an eruption of chaos energy that cleaved through the stars. The psychic shockwave extinguished the guiding light of the Astronomicon, the beacon of which all Imperial worlds were joined. Vigilus was cut off from the main body of the Imperium, isolated in the dark half of the galaxy that came to be known as the Imperius Nihilus. But worse still, the physically charged force fields that had so far kept the orcs at bay flickered and fell. As soon as the defense dropped, the orcs launched themselves against the hive sprawls once more. Their thundering fleets of trucks and war buggies plowed through the lines of Vigilite defenders and into the densely packed cities, while waves of boys barreled out of battle wagons, their guns blazing as they charged headlong into their enemies. Whole macro districts were lost to flames or overrun completely by the seemingly endless tide of greenskin warriors. As the beleaguered forces of Vigilus fought to hold back the rampaging orcs, refugees began flooding to the planet. Survivors from worlds that had been completely consumed by chaos entities that had been unleashed in the Imperium Nihilus, as well as fragment forces from other war zones, desperately seeking a place where they could stand and fight. Amongst those that arrived on Vigilus were Space Marine strike forces that had been cast adrift in the war-torn Stygius sector. They immediately joined the battle against the orc invaders, and the greenskins were more than happy to give these new arrivals a violent welcome. Amongst the manifold mobs that descended upon the Imperial world were those whose violent spree set them apart. Krogskull's Boys are one such mob. Long before the force fields on Vigilus fell, Krogskull Draka and his mob of burner boys had been tearing their way through the Adeptus Mechanicus continent of Mega Borealis inside the perimeter. There were only two things that Krogskull loved: cobbling together weapons and ripping enemies apart. The Mega Borealis, with its mile-high mounds of scrap and heavily entrenched defenders, offered ample opportunity for the orc spanner to engage both of his passions. Yet when he had first arrived on Vigilus, the metal-encrusted continent had lain tantalizingly sealed behind psycho-electrical force fields. The chance had come for Krogskull when the orc hordes, led by Big Mag Ragzak, started shelling Borehive Ultras, which lay just inside the perimeter of Mega Borealis. A massive spindle had broke free from the hive and toppled through the force field, creating a bridge through which Krogskull could pass into the continent. He had surged through the fallen structure, along with hundreds of other greenskins, but their numbers had been swiftly depleted by the energy of the force field and the Adeptus Mechanicus bombardment, targeted at their own structure to ensure that the inbound orcs did not set foot on Mega Borealis. Aside from Krogskull, only a handful of burner boys had made it through the makeshift tunnel before it imploded, and being the biggest and most psychotic, Krogskull had led them ever since. Only slightly less violent than Krogskull is Skarzot Ironboot, an orc constantly covered with burns he received from administering gouts of flame to his enemies at extremely close range. The overly zealot Zogger Stompskrumpa is often first into the fray, screaming obscene prayers to Gork and Mork as he rushes the enemy, while the completely fearless and profoundly stupid Fragbag Squigbiter lobs stick bombs all over the battlefield just to see what happens to the surrounding terrain when the crude grenades detonate. Krogskull crouched behind a tangle of pipes, peering through the stream that hung around the vast metal stacks. It was a good hiding spot for the Orc Spanner, perfect for launching a sneak attack on the approaching Adeptus Astartes patrol. He could feel the reverberations of 100 rumbling furnaces dotted throughout the industrial sprawl, their dolorous clangor mixing with the high-pitched sounds of promethium allocators and salvation fans. Krogskull enjoyed loud noises as much as the next orc, but he preferred sounds of a violent variety, those produced by guns, bombs, and breaking bones. He knew the enemy would come soon, but he hated waiting. Through a plume of smoke, Krogskull could make out one of his burner-boys, hunched next to a nearby stack. It was Fragbad Squigbiter, a particularly stupid orc, but one with a savant-like knack of explosive carnage. Fragbad had a stick bomb in his hand, and he was absent-mindedly bashing it against a leaking promethium valve. "Oi!" yelled Krogskull. The slack-jawed Fragbad looked up at him, but continued banging his stick bomb into the valve. Krogskull's blood began to boil, and a green mist clouded his already psychotic mind. It had taken all his cunning to plan this ambush, and he was not going to let one of his boys ruin the surprise by blowing himself up. He leveled his custom Mega Blaster at Fragbad's lolling face and yelled at him again. "Stop that, you zogging idiot!" Fragbad looked blankly at the bigger orc, a thick strand of saliva dangling from one of his fangs. His mouth twisted into a snarl, but he tucked the stick bomb away on his belt. "What's going on?" yelled an orc voice from high above. Krogskull cranked his neck to see which of the boys was making the ruckus. "Who's yelling?" cried another greenskin from below. Then other orcs started shouting at each other from the various hiding places. The green mists in Krogskull's mind coalesced into a seething ball of rage. The Spanner raised his scrap-built gun and fired a dozen blasts into the surrounding infrastructure before bellowing in fury. "Shut up, the lot of you!" Krogskull's boys were silent, or at least they were quiet enough that they couldn't be heard over the racket of the Imperial machinery. Just then, Krogskull saw something at the corner of his vision. He whipped his head around and caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure darting up through the billowing smog along some sort of a wire. Then he felt a shudder run through the gantry upon which he was standing, as though a massive weight had just landed on the rusted metal granting. Krogskull turned and saw what had caused the impact: a Space Marine Reaver, heavy pistol in one hand, combat knife in the other, with the cruel skull mask covering his face. The Reaver let out a howling battle cry, amplified to a mind-splitting intensity by his Vox grill, and fired at Krogskull. His shot struck a pipe above the orc's shoulder, sending a shower of metallic shrapnel flying as the mass-reactive core of the bolt detonated. The Reaver was quick to retrain his pistol on his target, but the Orc Spanner was quicker. A white-hot pulse from Krogskull's custom Mega Blast lanced through the Reaver's chest plate, sending the Space Marine careening back over the edge of the gantry before the echoes of his war cry had even fallen silent. Krogskull's mouth frothed as the battle lust took hold of his body. The ball of rage in his mind erupted like an angry star. Without a thought, he opened his jaws and bellowed his own deafening call to war. Krogskull barreled out of his hiding place and along the metal walkway. His eyes were darting back and forth in search of someone to kill. He didn't have to look far. A pair of Reavers, crouching behind the arm of a fallen crane, snapped off shots at the homicidal orc. One bolt struck Krogskull in the thigh, ripping off a hunk of green flesh, but it was not enough to slow him, and he hurled himself at his enemies with reckless abandon. Meanwhile, Krogskull's boys had heard their Spanner's war cry, and were themselves bursting out from within the knots of pipework and derelict hatches to butcher the newly arrived combatants. On the lower levels, it was the burner boy Zogger Stompskrumpa that charged the fastest and bellowed the loudest. And as he ran, he saw a reaver descending through the air from a macro distiller, wing-like grab chutes slowing the Space Marine's descent.
"Mork and Gork,"
cried Zogger, with a ferocious zeal. Then he let bursts rip. Gouts of flame sprayed upward, burning towards the airborne reaver. The reaver closed his grab chutes to drop beneath the incoming flame, falling the final score of feet to the floor below. Zogger dashed straight towards his enemy, yelling more fanatical prayers to the Greenskin's god. The Ork let out another burst of fire, but the reaver tumbled sideways to safety and readied his weapon. Suddenly, another of Krogskull's boys came charging out from behind the macro distiller. This Ork was closer to the reaver, and for a moment, Zogger feared that he had lost his chance to kill. But the reaver extended his arm and fired a bolt straight into the outflanking Ork's head. With chunks of skull matter raining down and the reaver distracted, Zogger hefted his burner and swung the red-hot nozzle at his foe. The reaver managed to parry the blow with his knife, but Zogger swung again, this time catching the Space Marine on the back, cracking the housing of his power pack and sending him sprawling. The reaver rolled over, heavy bolt pistol in hand, but was struck by another powerful blow as Zogger leapt bodily on top of his enemy. The pair grappled frantically, Zogger trying to hold his target down and crush his face with the end of his burner, while the reaver blocked with his vambrance and lashed back with his combat knife. As Zogger reared back to deliver another blow, the reaver slammed the butt of his pistol into the Ork's jaw, knocking him to the ground. The reaver stood up and raised his gun, and as he was about to deliver the coup de grace, when a stick bomb exploded inches behind him. The stick bomb had been dropped down from the upper gantries by Fragbad Squigbiter. The dim-witted Greenskin had remained behind the stack since the battle first erupted, and when Krogskull had dashed off to fight the Adeptus Astartes, Fragbad had resumed hammering away at the leaking Promethean valve. He had heard the other boys in his kill team firing at the Reavers, and although it sounded like they were having fun, Fragbad had been far too engrossed in his task to pay them any mind. When the sounds of fighting below had become too distracting, he had accidentally dropped the stick bomb he was using as a mallet, so he grabbed his burner by the nozzle and used it to club the dripping valve with a series of powerful swings. While Fragbad was hammering, a reaver crept through the steam towards him, drawn to the percussive sound, and with his bolt carbine at the ready. The reaver stepped past a broad column of intertwined pipes and locked his target in his sights. Just as Fragbad completed his obsessive-driven task, the Ork swung the butt of his burner down into the valve, wrenching the rusted components from the stack it was attached to. A geyser of promethium gushed out horizontally from the rent, covering the reaver. Filled with a sense of profound accomplishment, Fragbad turned around in search of something else to destroy, and there he saw the reaver being driven back along the gantry by the promethium torrent. Fragbad spun his burner around in his hand, pointed the nozzle at the reaver, and squeezed the trigger. He watched in silent joy as the promethium caught fire, and the Space Marine was engulfed in a raging inferno. Fragbad stepped aside as the flames raced up the promethium steam into the stack. Through the labyrinth of pipework, the inferno raged out of Fragbad's sight, until a few moments later it reached the promethium reservoir. The reservoir exploded in a pillar of flames, bathing the industrial landscape in a fiery orange light. Skarzat Ironboot was close to the refinery when it exploded, so close that the wave of intense heat caused his skin to bubble and blister. But the Ork was already covered in so much burns from previous fights that he barely noticed. A second later, the blast from the explosion hit. The surge of air caused Skarzat to stumble, almost stepping off the bridge in which he was standing, while at the other end of the bridge, a reaver dived out onto the grating to avoid a hunk of flaming wreckage that had been flung from the silo. Skarzat quickly recovered his footing, and seeing the downed opponent, charged forward in the hopes of caving in the reaver's head. But the reaver had sighted the incoming Ork, and he pulled out his grapnel launcher, shot a line to the top of the nearest stack, and triggered the serval switch. The reaver began to zip into the air, pulled along the grapnel line by a powerful winch, but Zogrod was too close to let his enemy get away. The Ork leapt off the bridge and grabbed onto the reaver's back. The additional weight of the hulking Ork body caused the grapnel launcher to grind to a halt, and the pair swung heavily into the metal siding of the stack. With his free hand, the Reaver attempted to backhand stab into the greenskin's flank, but Skarzat caught the Reaver's wrist, and with a single mighty tug, ripped the Space Marine's arm out of his socket. At this time, the Reaver let go of the grapnel launcher, and they both fell to the plate flooring below. Skarzat lay on the ground in a pool of his enemy's blood, listening to the sounds of battle, and trying to remember when he'd last had this much fun. And those were 40 facts on Krogskull's boys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope it kind of showed you how crazy orc fighting is. More importantly, how orcs operate when they're fighting. We always get asked the question of, if a Space Marine wearing red is fighting the orcs, is the Space Marine faster? And the answer is no. The way that orcs work is, if they believe it, it comes true. But really what that means is their probability of an outcome being positive towards the orc is higher because of the greenskin's luck emitting from their Wa energy. So in other words, the Wa energy is affecting the probability in their favor. Kind of like that one superhero in the Deadpool movie. I've made this connection a couple times, but I just want to re-emphasize because I have an actual example from the lore. When the dumb orc, the Badruck, drops his stick bomb and it hits the Reaver and it explodes and it saves the other orc, that's an example of how the probability of how orcs are lucky, basically. So when they say yellow things go boom, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's true for everything. It's just that the probability of something being yellow, because the orcs believe that it's going to make a bigger explosion, somehow something's going to affect luck, and yes, it is going to make a bigger explosion, if that kind of makes sense. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope that makes sense. I mean, this kill team is pretty interesting. I got this for Christmas. I got this box set, the Ork kill team box set, over Christmas, and I'm probably just going to build more, what do they call them, looters, because they're pretty good. Orc shooting is pretty awesome now. Burner Boys are okay, it's just that their range kind of sucks, so if you drop them in, expect them to die first turn, and they don't really do that much. Because they are 9 inches away from the enemy. So Burner Boys are, unless you put them on a truck, maybe they'll be beneficial. I don't know. Comment down below if you actually play orcs, and if you use Burner Boys effectively, what is the most effective way to use a Burner Boy? Because I haven't really figured it out. But again, this is for the actual 40k game, not Kill Team, because Kill Team has different rules. Can't wait to hear your guys' response. If you guys have any other suggestions, comment down below, and thanks for listening, guys. I'll talk to you tomorrow. This was Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate signing out.
Oh, I used to put my freedom first, and then